So thanks for joining for our delayed but finally here panel on social housing. I want to thank you all for showing up today for this very interesting topic. I'm Jacqueline Menino-Sapat, your moderator, and I work for the City of San Jose's Housing Department on Policy, Equity, and Inclusion. And I'm part of the Coalition of Housers Working Group. I'm going to share my screen. Can folks see my screen? Thumbs up. Okay, great. COHO was created to support the growth of future housing professionals through workshops, trainings, and networking opportunities, recognizing that in order for us to solve our affordable housing crisis, we must grow our community of housers. I also want to shout out our fellow COHO member, Kat Wortham, who worked hard to coordinate this event as well, but she's not able to join us today. And this event was planned by the Human Rights Institute, Affordable Housing Network, South Bay Community Land Trust, First Community Housing, and COHO. So thanks for these groups for making it happen. We have some amazing speakers from these orgs to speak this evening, including William Armaline, who is the director of San Jose State University's Human Rights Institute, Ken Ko, who is a former resident and homeowner of social housing in Singapore, Regina Williams, the director of housing development at First Community Housing, and Jocelyn Hernandez, the co-founder of the South Bay Community Land Trust. So they plan to speak about what is social housing, how is it different from affordable housing, how is social housing implemented internationally, specifically in Singapore, and how is the South Bay Community Land Trust working to advance this idea here in San Jose. Then we'll have some time for Q&A and info on how to keep in touch. With that being said, I'm happy to introduce Bill, who will speak more about his research on social housing. Okay. Oops, I'll stop my share. Okay, Bill, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Are we good? Cool. So first of all, I want to say it's really a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Jacqueline and all of my other panelists who I'm really psyched to join this evening. I'm among really talented colleagues, so I'm going to try and be really brief. My job tonight, I decided I'm not going to go deep into like heavy research because I think that kind of defeat the purpose of the conversation. So I'm going to do the kind of overarching basic concepts and kind of an overarching view of what social housing is and how California at the moment is approaching it through one particular piece of legislation. So first of all, I would really be an absentee at my job at the Human Rights Institute if I didn't make this first point and say that housing is absolutely a human right. This is not up for debate. This is not controversial when it comes to international law in the slightest bit. Just so we understand how this works according to international law, there isn't a specific article that says the right to housing. However, it's within another one that mentions not only housing, but things like food and other kinds of staples that are necessary for human survival. So the adequate right to housing is well established as part of the human right to an adequate standard of living, as articulated in the Article 11 of ICESCR. What we need to understand here is, according to the human rights instrument that I just noted, we have 3 freedoms and 3 entitlements that come from this right when it comes to international law. These 3 freedoms, and the first one is notable for any of us that are following international current events right now in Israel and elsewhere, protections against forced evictions and arbitrary destruction and demolition of one's home. Number 2, the right to be free from arbitrary, my typo, of course, free from arbitrary interference with one's home, privacy, and family. 3, the right to choose one's residence, to determine where to live, and freedom of movement. And then these 4 entitlements, or things that must be available to someone who has a problem that they need to rectify with, according to this right. So first is security of tenure. That goes back to the getting kicked out of your house. So you have to know that you can actually continue to live in the place you live. Number 2, housing, land, and property restitution. In other words, if the state or someone else comes and takes your stuff, You should have restitution. You should be able to get those resources back where it's equivalent. Equal and non-discriminatory access to adequate housing. I think that's going to come up quite a bit this evening. So maybe we'll have more time to talk about housing discrimination and how that kind of plays out. For participation in housing-related decision-making at national and community levels. And so this is actually really important too, because what this means is that all people should have a right to have a say in the way that housing is being governed by their both local and national governments. That's huge, as many of you know in this call. So I want to point it out as a specific that's noted in our that's noted as housed in our articulated right to housing or adequate standard. Sorry, a little tongue-tied there. Now I'm not going to read through all this text. Don't worry, I won't do this to you. That's bad teaching on a slide, but I did want to present the information so you see kind of the difference here. First, I just want to define what social housing is. And as you notice, I'm just going to have some bullets because different folks define it differently. So I'm going to try and pull together some basic concepts. First, it treats housing as a right and as a public good. So like we saw, housing is a human right. Social housing takes that quite seriously. And one of its goals typically is to make housing available to all. Two, the public and nonprofit sector takes some permanent ownership or stewardship rather. So that means the public, the state, or some nonprofit organizations or community organizations might take a permanent stake and stewardship in that housing development, apartment complex, or what have you. This is different from affordable housing that you'll hear about later, because affordable housing in the United States is a public-private partnership. Social housing is actually not that. Social housing is fairly stringently in the public and nonprofit space. Housing is protected from markets and market speculation. That should be no mystery to anyone living in the Bay Area. We are amidst yet another massive housing bubble, which is why a two-bedroom home costs $1 million and $2 million, $3 million at this point. It can be rental or ownership or equity property. It can be both. Most people think that social housing is only for rental. Actually, social housing can be available for renting and for purchase or a limited equity arrangement. It also provides opportunities for desegregation, resident governance, and deliberate community infrastructure and resources. This is super important because one of the reasons that social housing has been used in so many communities across the world has actually been to address segregation that's left over from colonial relationships and other sorts of segregated communities and regimes. Another thing is it opens a door for democratic decision-making for those who actually live in that housing community. And third, as you see here, typically social housing developments will include other elements of infrastructure, everything from like daycare centers to health clinics to community gardens. It provides an opportunity for those kinds of things to be deliberately put into play. Now, I just want to kind of compare this to how social housing is being defined in a bill I'll discuss here in a minute, which is AB 387, or the Social Housing Act of 2021 under Assemblymember Lee. And under this definition, we see some pretty close similarity. Housing units are owned and managed by a public entity, local housing authority, or mission-driven not-for-profit private entity. Each social housing development contains housing units that accommodates a mix of household income ranges. This is another piece that I want to kind of highlight in social housing schemes, is that often they'll be mixed income. In other words, they're not only focused at those quote unquote at the bottom, that there are these ideas, and hopefully we can talk about them later, about how you can get solidarity among wide stretches of the working class and middle class by building these as mixed income developments. It also allows for the higher incomes of those who make more to subsidize the kinds of things that can be done for those that perhaps can contribute less. We can come back into that later. And I'm not going to go through all this. I just want to point out the similarities that are reflected in the bill. Residents of the housing units enjoy full protection against termination without just cause. There's that tenure piece and so forth. Oh, sorry. And so this social housing bill, AB 387, or the Social Housing Act of 2021, some key takeaways. It's a 2-year bill in the early phase. It creates what's being called the California Social Housing Council. And this council will be charged to hold public meetings and do some sort of public education stuff and public information gathering. And its goal will be to develop policy, to put forward social housing in California. And it notes specifically the Vienna model as a model that it's working from, which I think is very important, as I'll note here in a second. Because the Red Vienna model, and no, I'm not going to read all this text either, the Red Vienna model is a really sort of an international model or basis for social housing in the world. And what I want to say from the Red Vienna model is essentially that it comes from sort of revolutionary history, not just in Austria, but all over this sort of region of Europe at the time in the early 20th century. And you see that it goes through a little bit of a transformation in terms of its uses, but Red Vienna was a largely or entirely public run and state run institution. In other words, the state built all of this housing in the housing community, and it was made available to folks to use. The Red Vienna model is interesting to note because of all of the models that we'll probably hear about today. It is the most publicly owned. It's the one that creates the largest public trust or public good, if you will. As you see at the close here of the text, continue to build desirable social housing after the war, and today 62% of the city's residents live in social housing compared to 5% in New York City. So this is also to say that even though this housing has been around for quite a while, it's still quite popular across the board. We also have more modern examples, such as the Sylvan Hymens in Brussels. There's actually one of a pair of developments that's in Brussels. And this begins to play with some role for the private sector. So it moves a little bit away from the Red Vienna model. But it's interesting because of the sort of variety of housing and the quality of housing that it's been able to create. Named after the soap factory that used to occupy the state, it is less than half a mile from Brussels Central Square. It comprises dozens of units of varying types, studios, lofts, duplexes, and apartments ranging from 1 to 6 bedrooms. So this is to say also that in comparison to what a lot of us think of in the United States as sort of like typical public housing, social housing models actually offer a huge variety of sizes, arrangements, and living situations. And with this, I'm going to pass it to our next panelist. And again, what I was trying to do is just give us a sort of basis. What does social housing mean? How is housing defined as a human right in the world? And what might social housing have to do with providing for that human right? And I wanted to give us this kind of an idea of a couple examples in the world of where we might see social housing being successful. And we're going to see some more examples from some of the other panelists.
Thank you so much, Bill. Yes, so we're going to pass this over to Ken Ko, who's our next panelist, former resident and owner of social housing in Singapore. And I will unmute you, Ken, no worries. All right. Ken, you can unmute yourself? Okay, got it.
Am I on?
Yes, yes you are.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to share the experience of public housing in Singapore, which has been widely acclaimed as one of the most successful in the world. Jacqueline, are you going to start the slides, please? As of today, over 80% of Singapore's population of 5.5 million live in public housing, comprising over 1 million high-rise flats. 90% of those living there own their own homes. Only 10% are renters, comprising mostly the smaller flats. Ownership is based on 99 years leasehold of the flats, not freehold. Next, please. Public housing was part of the promise of independence from British rule in 1959. It did not fall like manna from heaven. Post-war Singapore's rapid growth as a major trading port due to its location and deep water ports attracted significant migration from other Asian countries and resulted in some of the worst slums. The British attempted to build low-rise public housing but succeeded only in completing 21,000 flats. Next, please. The People's Action Party that led the anti-colonial struggle and came to power in 1959 and remains so to this day for a total of 62 years, just 10 years short of the Chinese Communist Party in China, pledged to build public housing as part of its electoral promise. In its first 5 years of office, 100,000 public housing flats were completed, mostly for rent. The real spike came when home ownership became the goal, based on the belief that a property-owning citizenship would have a bigger stake in the destiny of their country. Next.
Hey, bro, you gonna keep that? You want some?
Let me share with you. Let me share with you some of the key factors that help the success of Singapore's public housing program. Next. The state's liberal exercise of its right of eminent domain in acquiring land for public housing and related infrastructural development, including the demolition of squatter colonies. Landowners were often compensated at well below market price. There was aggressive land reclamation from the side, as much as 25%. Home ownership is well and good, but it's also dependent not only on affordability, but also on financing. In Singapore, we have the Central Provident Fund, which is our equivalent of the US Social Security. There's a monthly contribution of as much as 20% of your salary from the employee and another 17% from the employer. Residents were allowed access to their Central Provident Fund to finance their home purchase. The high-rise public housing blocks were clustered into 24 housing estates, which emerged as self-sufficient new townships, complete with their own shopping and food outlets, medical, financial services, recreational facilities, car parks, and were well integrated with public transport networks that link them to each other and to downtown. Next. Next. In the planning of the public housing estates, conscious efforts were made to avoid ethnic conclaves through ethnic diversity. There was always a balance between rental and home-owned flats, as well as diversity of sizes and prices. To control speculation, only those who do not own any private housing were allowed to buy public housing, and they were limited to only one flat per owner. The flats had to be retained by the original owner for an initial 5 years. Priority was given in the allocation of new flats, which were of course cheaper, to first-time property owners and newly married couples. There was a continuous upgrading of older housing estates, which included wholesale demolition and reconstruction to introduce new creative designs and refinements that enhance asset value. Due to the economies of scale involved in public housing, program construction costs are minimized, and the overall economy is kept in a state of perpetual boom. Next, please. This chart or this table gives you an idea of the range of room sizes or flat sizes and their market prices. Starting from the largest 5 rooms, which in fact meant only 3 bedrooms, 1 living and 1 dining room, with a space of about 195 to 125 square meter. 1 square meter equals 100 square feet, and the price is given in Singapore dollars. The current exchange rate is 1.3 Singapore dollar to 1 US dollar. So 480,000 would translate roughly into slightly less than 400,000 or in the highest 300,000. The 4-room flat comprises of 3 bedrooms and 1 combined living and dining room that was smaller. And you can see from here, the smallest unit were the 2-room unit, which consists of approximately 500 square feet, but these were for rentals only. Now, to give you an idea of their affordability, the latest per capita gross income in Singapore is 60,000 US per household. So that translates itself into a factor of about 5 for the smallest 3-room unit that were available for purchase. Next page. Oh, can I just quickly clarify that the resale price of newly completed units, the resale price on the right column, they tend to display a much wider range of values compared to the sale price of brand new flats that you purchase directly from the government. They were higher based on a number of factors. Next page, please. Within each flat type, there are variations in the prices based on the housing estate. Older estate tends to command a lower price than newer estate. Selling prices also depend on the location of the housing estate in terms of proximity to downtown and to the mass rapid transit stations in each estate. That is why you had such a wide range of prices of the same size of flat in each housing estate. The Housing and Development Board, which is the government agency tasked with public housing development, the motto has been limited limited land, unlimited space. Older blocks were 12 stories high compared to 36 stories now. They were larger but crude and simple, while newer flats are smaller by about 10–15%, but aesthetically better. The latest innovation in Singapore's public housing are studio flats for retirees who need living space but have depleted their pensions in mortgage payments over the years and have to downgrade to smaller flats to subsist on the difference realized. I would like to conclude by clarifying that public housing in Singapore has got nothing to do with socialist policy or socialist program. Public housing, as you have all heard, is a human right. Singapore's economy is fully integrated into global capitalism. There are no minimum wage policy nor even unemployment insurance. Every resident, however, has a roof over their head while foreign workers stay in employers' hostel. No one is homeless. Social housing ensures social stability and public health. I would like to share with you some photos of what the public housing estate looks like. This is a macro view of the exterior of a public housing estate. The picture in the center and on the right are the access entrance to one housing block. Next page. Next. This is the micro view of a, sorry, can we go back to the previous one? This is the micro view of a small flat comprising of 2 rooms. Picture on the left is that of the kitchen. Picture on the right is the bedroom, and the floor plan is given on the right. Next slide. This is the micro view of the larger flat, the 5 rooms. Photo on the left is the kitchen. Photo in the center is the living and the dining room. And photo on the right is the bedroom. I would just like to end on a personal note. I became the proud owner of my first public housing flat in 1975, which I bought for 40,000 Singapore dollars, or just slightly over 30,000 US. It was on a new estate built on reclaimed land that was separated from the sea by a new park. Life was wonderful. I was able to do my daily runs in the park every morning and open my windows to sleep in the cool sea breeze at night without the assistance of AC. In 1980, 5 years later, I sold the same apartment for $80,000 or double my price. If I had kept that same flat, the market value today is about $1 million Singapore dollars. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Ken, for sharing your experience. It was really valuable to hear your experience and expertise on this real firsthand experience. So our next speaker will be Regina, who will tell us a little bit more about affordable housing and how that compares to social housing.
Wow. Hello, everyone. Good evening. That is so inspiring. Just makes us want to push the limits on what we were doing here in the United States. Can we go to the first slide, please? So I'm Regina Celestin Williams. I work as the Director of Housing Development at First Community Housing. And my job this evening is to talk a little bit more about the traditional way that we build affordable housing in the United States, and give a little bit of color to what Bill described as the public-private partnerships that we develop that housing through utilizing the low-income housing tax credit. So unfortunately, I'm gonna get a little technical, but hopefully not too much in the weeds today. Next slides, please. So just a little bit about the low-income housing tax credit. It was created by the Tax Reform Act of 1986. It's in Section 42 of the Internal Revenue Code. So from there, you can understand that this program, our housing program, is regulated by the IRS in this country. So very interesting. Most folks would think that, you know, our Housing and Urban Development Department at the federal level regulates housing, but actually it's this program regulated by the IRS, which essentially is sort of a watchdog type of organization at the federal level, right? They are the ones who regulate this program. It is a part of the tax code. The way that it is incentivized is that there's a allocation of 9% housing tax credits that go to states. So every state receives an allocation of these more valuable tax credits because they raise more credits to sell to the market. And then every state also receives an allocation of tax-exempt bonds, which come with, if you can access those tax-exempt bonds, building affordable housing, then you also get what's called 4% low-income housing tax credits, which is roughly, 50% less than the 9% tax credit. So we have one that's more valuable, more credits, more competitive to get those credits, and there's fewer of them at the state level. And then we have the 4% tax credits, which we refer to as non-competitive, less competitive, and they're more accessible. So what happens is we that build affordable housing in the state, we structure these developments so that we're restricting rents, only charging for a 1-bedroom, so certain amount of rent, depending on where it's located, versus a 3-bedroom, a certain amount of rent, and that we're income targeting. So we're looking for populations, the big populations, to live in this housing that don't make more than a certain amount of income. And so if we do this, amongst other state priorities, there's all kinds of points and ranking that you can do to compete for this funding source. But if we do those two basic things of restrict the rents and target certain low-income populations, then we can compete at the state level for these tax credits. This is what states do all across the country. We do it here in California quite regularly, and it's very competitive. There's a huge affordable housing industry structured in California around going after these tax credits. And so this is a very large funding source, and the main way that affordable housing is built in the United States, substantially the main way. And in fact, it creates more than 100,000 affordable housing units a year. And typically, when the federal government looks at increasing affordable housing production, they're looking at increasing the amount of either 9% low-income housing tax credits or tax-exempt bonds allocated to states. So this is just to sort of give you a sense of how this is a public-private partnership. Next slide, please. So what does this all mean? Essentially, affordable housing has been privatized in this country. We have tax credits, and tax credits are the main creator of affordable housing. So on one side, we have a tax credit, which you can only access if you have taxable income that you want to shelter. And then we have affordable housing, which is a public good, is a human right, right? And we're using the private market, those who need tax shelter, to build the affordable housing. So we have tax credits that are sold to financial institutions and corporations who can use these tax credits. So what does that mean? They have to have lots of profit, because if you have a bad year, you don't need tax credits. You don't need ways to write off, the taxes that you might owe the federal government. So we have these investors that are driven, by profit and by a desire to reduce their tax liability to the federal government. And then we have these tax credit investors who use these tax benefits that come with building the affordable housing to offset their tax liability. In order to do that, they actually have to be owners of the affordable housing development. And so we have very complex structures. We have lots of attorneys and legal teams involved to bring in these high power, high profit corporation and financial institutions into the creation of this public good and transfer the tax credits to them with a limited risk and liability to these tax credit investors. And we have a very sophisticated way of doing that. But essentially, what it all leads to is affordable housing developers working to build communities that serve the communities we want to serve, house the people we want to house. But at the end of the day, we know that we're competing for a commodity that the investors have to want. They have to want to invest in our projects. So there are certain thought processes that we as developers have to take into account in terms of risk, in terms of what we're building, what we're offering, and that is to attract those investors. And that means we have, at the end of the day, the private market that's profit driven, having a determining, monitoring, being responsible for affordable housing. Next slide, please. So I think that, you know, regardless of these challenges, there are states that really push affordable housing in the traditional sense that's built through tax credits to meet the needs of the communities. Right now, you know, we have a big push in the state of California to serve those who are unhoused in our community in an effort to end homelessness. The image that we have here is actually First Community Housing's first permanent supportive housing development, but it was actually the first permanent supportive housing built, 100% permanent supportive housing built in the city of San Jose, and it just opened in 2019. So, you know, while this program has been around for quite some time, we're just starting to really push the program, I think, to do what we need to do to make sure that there is an end to homelessness. We at First Community Housing are very committed to using the tax credit program to doing that, but we're also, we understand the limitations of the program, the low-income housing tax credit program, and that's why, you know, I'm here tonight, because social housing is an option, and we hope to see many more options to make sure that everyone has housing and shelter in the community. So with that, I will wrap up my comments.
Thank you, Regina. Really appreciate it. Thank you for sharing the detail on what is actually here, and then of course what's real. You know, First Community Housing is there, and it's a great resource for our community. Our next speaker is Jocelyn Hernandez, who is a co-founder of the South Bay Community Land Trust, and she'll tell us a little more about that.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you to all my fellow panelists. I have learned so much. My name is Jocelyn Hernandez, and I am here happy to represent the South Bay Community Land Trust. Before I begin, I do want to honor the fact that I am right now in Sacramento and on occupied Nisenan land, and that the work that I do is in San Jose, and which is occupied Ohlone land. And you can go to the first slide, please. And I think the importance of recognizing that history is because as the South Bay COT, we center the history of housing in order to really understand how we can move forward with a vision of homes for all. And I can share very much, you know, our mission does touch on some of the points that came up around social housing in terms of trying to create like mixed income models in order to house our most vulnerable and marginalized in the city. And also understanding that moderate income communities, by definition of Santa Clara, cover wages like teachers and folks that are probably in fact closer to working class. And so our mission with the South Bay Community Land Trust is to acquire and manage property for community development. We do this by organizing around and creating community envisioning in order to be able to combat the gentrification and the displacement that continues to impact San Jose. Next slide, please. San Jose, well, the CLT in particular comes from a vision that community members had in San Jose following the infamous Google project that was presented in San Jose a couple years back. And so Google and this project is not anything unusual. It is in fact definitely a history within San Jose of our tech booms and our tech bust. And so this is definitely was a moment where we wanted to really challenge community to envision development that didn't have to include displacement. As we know, Google has a history of racism and history of surveillance. And so we didn't want this type of development impacting our communities here in San Jose. And so we looked and we came across this model that actually stems from the Black liberation movement, particularly in the South, and the COT model in itself in the United States, starting with the New Communities Incorporated by a group of Black farmers following the 1950s. And so I think from there comes this really holistic vision of a COT, not just housing, but a COT as a haven, as a point of community where we can ground and receive all other needs like food, like housing, and the list of international needs that William walked us through in the beginning of our discussion. And so next slide, please. And so the COT, and without going into the various technicalities, arises when community members want to organize and move outside of the market, the housing market that that we are unable to keep up with. And so when we are seeing gentrification and displacement, and we're seeing housing costs and living costs increasing, there's an inability for community members to be able to stay in San Jose. And so the COT model works by acquiring land, and I will share with y'all how later, and taking it out of the market. And so this is the very fundamental part of social housing, which is the decommodification part. And so by taking it off the land, we are taking it off the market and putting it into a community land trust. The land and prices tied to it will be protected from speculation for generations to come. And so this is the mechanism that the COT uses in order to guarantee this permanently affordable housing. Next slide, please. So we mentioned social housing, and we mentioned that there's like a lot of different understandings or even definitions when it comes to it. And I think what has guided our work at the COT is framing it within whatever the model might be, framing it within these 5 pillars in order to support ourselves and the work, in order to be able to maintain these values. And so when we are looking at housing models or how we want to move forward at the as a COT, we are really looking at community control, the decommodification mechanism happening. And so first and foremost, that in any model that we seek to acquire, that it is decommodified so the community can have control and prevent it from being displaced when prices go up. The second is really having and emphasizing the community and community land trust so we can envision housing that is truly accessible and inclusive for all. We know that with the history of the United States, housing has been used as a tool by white supremacy to exclude communities, and the effects of which we still feel today. And so to be able to to address that, it is really fundamental to have community at the table. And the third pillar is, of course, these components of social housing, of being able to be protected from displacement, being able to have long-term stability in this housing. Fourth is the pillar of health and sustainability. The South Bay COT, we are looking for like dignified housing. A lot of us, myself included, have been unhoused, have experienced housing instability, and health and sustainability in housing, in order to have habitable units, is fundamental to community health. And lastly, affordability and redefining affordability to really encompass what is affordable to folks right now. And so all of these work in conjunction with the model of the COT, which we are a small group right now, but we have a vision of growing this base, and with that base, like having folks that are living on the COT be part of the decision making, and really incorporating this balance of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Next slide, please. I will very briefly talk to you that right now our work is excitingly moving towards what will be our first property, or what will be our first opportunity to really take this model off the ground. And it is through the preservation lane. As folks know, there's production of permanently affordable housing. There's protections of tenants and policies to be able to strengthen defense against displacement. And then there's also preservation. So we are seeing that preservation is a really viable lane in San Jose particularly, and in amidst the many vacant housing that we see in the city. And so prevention is one of our strategies, the one that we are moving forward right now, but the COT as a whole encompasses the ability to be flexible in the way that it acquires. Next slide, please. And I end with really emphasizing this component of community. Yes, we are definitely working right now with the city and with other stakeholders to be able to acquire what would be South Bay COT's property, but we also understand the COT as a tool and a flexible one through which we can acquire property through other means. We are very inspired by the work of other community members, including here we have the Black and Brown Workers Cooperative in Philadelphia, who were a collective of unhoused folks and advocates who were able to push city council, right? Like Ken said, nothing is ever given. So there's organizing component to be able to have safe haven in the areas where they were having their encampments. We also see at our top right corner, folks from the East LA cooperative campaign to create permanently affordable housing. This was a campaign where community got together and envisioned what would eventually become housing for low-income youth between the ages 18 and 25. And so in that community, they saw the need to provide these youth with housing. And so that is why that vision was directed towards them. In front center, we have campaigns, Moms for Housing, and we have Oakland mothers in the Bay Area who in early November 2019 occupied a vacant home. The campaign would eventually lead to communities gathering together around this notion of if there's vacant homes, like there shouldn't be unhoused folks on the street, much less mother and children's. And so this led to the acquisition through the Oakland COT of this property. And this property is now being used to house single mothers to continue that, that legacy that was started with these 4 Black moms. in addition to the policies, we also see how COTs are really used as a tool to create havens for historically marginalized communities. The House of Tulip is an incredible new COT that has started in New Orleans by Black trans women and gender non-conforming folks, and it is only growing. And so we are really excited because we see how COTs are definitely not the answer to anything, right? But a powerful tool to organize communities together. We see this again centering our history, that stewardship and COTs and understanding the history and land allows us to imagine what racial and gender justice and housing could look like. So so sitting in this history of these many harms, the COT comes out as a tool to have liberatory housing that is based upon a collective hope to move out of a predatory development model. Next slide, please. I thank you, and I again thank everybody, for my panelists, for really providing really important context to the work that is happening in San Jose. And I encourage you all to, first and foremost, if y'all have any houses that are just laying around that y'all want to donate over, please feel free. At the end of the day, this is definitely something that housing is not just a human right, it is a human responsibility. And as folks in this city, as folks in this world, we have a responsibility to be able to create this community where all of us are in dignified housing. So I encourage you to follow us on social media to stay updated on what might be going on with the COT. I also encourage you all to, if y'all would like to sign up and volunteer, or to invite us to any of your spaces, we would love to keep sharing this word of the COT and how it could be an incredible tool for transformation in San Jose. Thank you. I think that's all for me.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. That's actually all of our panelist speakers. And so we're going to move into some time for Q&A before we do some announcements and then other ways to keep in touch. So if you have a question, feel free to pull it into the chats. So I see there's one that came a bit earlier from Basil. Shared today. Well, there's going to be a link to this video. I think we can share. We can share a list of, just a simple list of these examples with you. We'll do a post-event email. Let's see, Shola, will we get a recording of the presentation? Yes, we'll send that in a future email to this group. And oh, there's a thank you to everyone being wonderful. Thanks, Ruth. So we have this time for Q&A. Just put forward some questions to our awesome panelists, all with varying experience and perspectives and lots of different models that we talked about today. So
Someone's hand is raised.
oh, someone's hand. Oh, okay. All right. First Basil and then Tessa.
Cool, thanks. Is there the infrastructure and capacity to model out what social housing can look like here in the South Bay, based off of like hard data, like the numbers of unhoused, underhoused, population trends, and then, through some sort of community workshops, designing housing that really fits the local character, I feel like that would be a great first step towards towards basically defining what it is that social housing is, and then creating a mandate for its legalization and funding.
So, does any of the panelists have some thoughts on that question, on the modeling and a plan to fully meet the needs that are out there?
I'm not sure. I was trying to figure out what your question was in there, Fem. I'll take a stab at it because I think you're making a suggestion. I agree with a lot of your suggestion. To the extent that you're asking a question, I mean, I'll tell you right now, that's not the problem standing in the way of social housing. The problem standing in the way of social housing is not that there aren't enough arguments about why it's needed. There aren't enough people who need it. There aren't enough communities meeting to solve housing issues. That's happening everywhere, and it's been happening forever. The problem is that those aren't the people that have the money and power in terms of making these policy decisions and making that capital available for use in the way that, for example, the community land trust would like to use it. So as you could hear with a social housing plan, you have to have the participation of the state, right? Unless you want to do it through the nonprofit sectors. And as we said, the most successful versions of this are actually done through the state, whether you're talking about Singapore, whether you're talking about Red Vienna, where you're talking about, right? So what do you need there? Well, you need state participation, you need state dollars, you need state investment. That has to be both made legal, if you will, because there's all sorts of barriers now because of developers putting those in. And you got to get them to do it. They got to be like politically willing to do so. And I agree with you that in California, where we all know that it's the developer class, landowners, and tech essentially runs the show in the state. There's a couple other small power centers, but that's pretty much it. If you want to look at, for example, who gives money to all the legislatures, all that kind of stuff, that's who we're talking about. What you're going to need there is actual people power to force that capital to do something different and to force those decision makers to do something different, because as of right now, it's pretty clear, where their bread is buttered. And they, unfortunately, is both parties. We're not talking about like, right. You have very few folks in this state that are not pretty deep in those pockets. So
to clarify, I'm talking about a specific plan, sort of like the Strong Neighborhoods Initiative from the 90s and early 2000s, that has a community design process across demographics, not just low-income residents, but really creates a consensus while designing what social housing will look like in that community context, as a political tool, but also to have something in place to catch the funding should it be made available at the state level.
Yeah, what I was just going to say is that seems to be the role, going back to the social housing bill that's been proposed, that seems to be the role that's going to be played by the California Social Housing Council. Although, again, we'll have to see how that shakes out, right?
Thank you.
Thanks so much for the question. So the next question is from Tessa. Would you please unmute yourself, Tessa?
Thank you so much. You can hear me? Yeah, and thanks. I'm sorry I missed a lot of the meetings. So I'm really looking forward to your video about social housing. But I noticed when I looked at the screen, some information that you had posted that, it was like how communities can really establish what they want in their community. And that's where we're dealing with in our neighborhood. That our city, I call it financializing our lands, taking it for development. And so we're in our historic neighborhood, we're getting hotel. And even after the general plan changed the general plan from residential to some housing, commercial housing, then they even delimited it even more not allowing affordable housing because it was too close to business and all these things that they created so they could keep a hotel because that's where they make their money. And, you know, and they're not meeting the crises that we have, you know, in terms of climate, you know, as well as, you know, housing and food security. So, you know, I guess I like the, I was wondering, you know, this whole concept of how communities can really, you know, create what they want in their neighborhood. Is there a mechanism for that? I don't know. I guess what somebody had said is that you have to like really get the people power to really protest what's happening. And that's something that we, you know, I've been trying to get my neighbors that we are going to be protesting this hotel so we could get more either housing or I say growing food, you know, to address one of our crises, at least, not a hotel, which doesn't do that. So anyway, was just wondering about how, you know, in the report, you know, in one of your screens, it was saying how community can choose what they want in their community. I was just wondering if you had any suggestions on how to do that.
Hello, Tessa. I can definitely start this question, and I do know that some other folks were in the chat from other CLT spaces, so I encourage y'all. I think that already it sounds like there's a strong foundation for the type of organizing work that like a CLT requires. To hear that you are like already in conversations with neighbors or in conversation with other tenants is definitely one of the foundations to figuring out like the hardest components sometimes, which is the collective vision. From there, there's like, I think depending on the CLT model, it looks very different. There has been cases where there has been negotiation with the landlord themselves, so the owner of the property. So that looks different in terms of like establishing a relationship with that person. There's also other models where, like I mentioned before, it revolves around organizing and, you know, political pressure to acquire those properties and to create, you know, funding and a space for that. And then I think, Matthew, it's Urban CLT. And then I am remembering the CLT in East LA that it was an entire campaign to outreach into the community to ask them like what they actually wanted on this development. And so it ended up turning into, the campaign culminated in this vision that the community then had to give over to like to the state, to the city, to the council, to let folks know that they were very serious about what they were proposing. A lot of times with CLTs or with community members in general asking for our vision, a lot of times we are not taken seriously. And there is definitely the power dynamics of city councils or counties believing that a technical professional has more understanding of what development is needed there than the community that actually lives there itself. Yes. I would love to connect further with you. I would love to continue this conversation offline. And if there's any other folks that want to add in, there's some folks also that has shared the Grounded Solution, which is a really incredible booklet. So maybe that's something that we can ask Jackie to send out, maybe these links that we have around like really, really important toolkits that other CLTs have put together. Mm-hmm.
Yes, happy to share the links. And thanks so much for addressing Tessa's question and continuing the conversation. So I do see a question from Allison. Is Silicon Valley at Home going to advocate for community land trusts in Santa Clara County? I don't know, Allison. Aren't you from SB at Home?
I think that was a different Allison.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry, wrong Allison. Allison Hicks is asking SB at Home this question, so.
I think that's an awesome question. I am the Policy and Research Associate at SV at Home, and I'm not fully comfortable answering that question on behalf of the organization. But Allison, I will get back to you on that.
Yeah, I don't think you have to, you don't have to make it a big program, but advocate for it here and there. I think CLTs are much more efficient than tax credits. If you look up tax credits on Wikipedia, they take over 60 billion out of our, our national tax base every year. And many people say other models would be more efficient and more effective. So I've worked for a CLT in the past, the Northern California Land Trust, and I would really like to see them down in Santa Clara County as well. And I'd like to see a little more talk about them. I'm so happy to hear you all here today, but I would like to hear more in this area. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Allison and Allison. I have a question from John Kindred. How does climate change impact your work? Also, has anyone addressed climate gentrification and climate migration / climate refugees, growing problems that we see on a global level, and sea level rise, which is, hits close to home. That's happening to my mom's hometown. So that's the reason why my family doesn't live there anymore.
I'll jump in first, although I don't know if there's others that have something to say here. So I think it's a really prescient question for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, we just saw a collapse of a building in Miami, and that's essentially what infrastructure protection is going to look like under market solutions. The reason that building collapsed essentially, and that many more are at risk of collapsing, not just in Miami, but many other coastal cities throughout the country, is because we have not made anywhere near the kinds of investments that need to be made to protect our already crumbling public and private infrastructure. For those of you who don't know, like that corrosive salt water down there is beating the hell out of those buildings. It's not just about the ocean level rise, it's about the salt and the corrosive materials in the air, right? So I guess this is my way of answering your question is we already know what the market solutions look like. And what market solutions look like is short-term profit. They don't look like long-term investment necessarily for the health. And by health, I don't just mean economic health. I mean actual physical health, social health of those that live in these places that are very quickly being relegated to what we would call sacrifice zones. And in fact, many places like Miami, where the people realize it right now or not, are going to be sacrifice zones because, again, the time has already passed since we should have made some of these investments to keep any number of things from happening, ocean encroachment being only one of them. So what does social housing provide? Well, social housing provides some non-market solutions to creating housing in ways that are deliberate and can make the kind of investments that are required to house lots of people in small spaces, which is another kind of key to climate change, and also in such a way that really reduces their footprint and is closer to transportation, closer to food, and these sorts of things, right? So social housing is being seen across the world actually as having a great deal of potential in terms of climate solutions, because the way that we live, not just in terms of like how far from each other and that kind of things, but the way that our communities are sort of integrated in terms of infrastructure are part of the things that are going to have to change for us to survive the century. So I can't talk about all of the connections to climate change, refugee climate refugees and all of that. There's tons to talk about there, and it's all very important. But these are some of the sort of overlaps, if you will.
Thank you, Bill. We have a question here from Eddie. How would resale work to keep some CLT ownership homes affordable, since our overpriced housing environment will be with us for a long time? I think this kind of touches on that limited equity framework that you're talking a bit about, Bill, right? So
yeah, I wasn't sure if Ken wanted to jump in, because I'm sure he could explain how it might work for flats in Singapore. But I will say that there are a number. So there's no one answer to your question, Eddie. There's a number of ways to do it, and different projects do it differently. And it also depends on the level of public investment in there as well. So just to give a couple examples, one is like a limited equity kind of arrangement, to where the equity in that home or that building is shared to some extent. And then there's some extent that's unique to the unit that can be purchased in terms of the equity in the whole sort of project or building, right? So instead of like, I have 100% equity in this condo and the place it sits on and all that, or this house and the land it sits on, etc., I may only have purchased 30% of that equity, and that's all that's actually open for resale. Now, just like you heard from Ken, it doesn't mean that those things can't go up and down in terms of value. Like Ken said, the social housing units in Singapore actually would have been a very good investment for that value. But what it does is it provides a certain amount of protection from speculation, because only a certain percentage of that unit is out on the market, so to speak. Another way that's really common is through these like long, and this is kind of one of the bases for CLTs on some level, are these like almost like infinite leases, right? So it's like you're not really purchasing or changing hands in terms of the land, but just in terms of the structure or the unit that's on top of it, where you get some like certain extended lease, like a 40 or 50-year lease or 100-year lease or something like that. So I just name these as two of many examples, but there's all kinds of ways for these things to be arranged. Now I'll yield to Ken or whoever might want to comment.
I just like to add that in Singapore, all the public housing apartments are based on 99 years leasehold. So essentially you're buying just 99 years. Of course, that's enough for at least 2 generations, right? But it is limited, and then it turns over. It goes back to the government, so they can afford to keep the cost more reasonable. And of course, what exists in Singapore is social security system, where every resident who works, has a job, has accumulated substantial retirement funds, which is then available to finance the purchase of the apartment. Now, while it solves the problem of putting a roof over your head, it creates another problem, because by the time most people retire, they have very little pension left to fund their retirement. And so they're often obliged to sell the unit that they have and downgrade to a cheaper, smaller unit, so that they can live on the difference between their appreciated property and the lower cost of their new unit. But you need to put in a whole set of rules that will limit and control speculation, so that people with a lot of capital cannot just move in and buy a whole bunch of units and then flip them and resell them. So the state has to intervene. There has to be state intervention in the market. I mean, in life, there's really no such thing as a completely free market. This is a mirage that is preached by the apologies of private interests.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you, Bill. If it's okay, I'm going to move on to, I think we have a few more questions.
Sure, sorry.
No, yeah. Thank you for your answer. So Denise asks, what can be done regarding LIHTC properties which are poorly managed? I think this seems like a question that is pretty specific, and that maybe some of us actually have some advice around. Right? Does any of the panelists have experience working with issues like this, and maybe would be willing to talk with Denise?
Sure. You mean connect offline, or should I attempt right now?
Or you can attempt right now, or either.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenge because, you know, we're sort of held up to a standard of being responsible landowners, property owners, and if you are having a hard time reaching out to your local government to talk about issues there, the best recourse really is to contact the owner or developer directly. There are monitoring agencies, and for California, that is, you know, a big allocation committee called the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. And, you know, I'm not sure how easy it is to get through to the folks at the state level, but trying to either work through the hierarchy at the property management company or work through the hierarchy at the developer owner level is a really good route, because you know, developers are awarded these competitive funding sources based on, you know, how well they operate their existing portfolios and how well they operate the projects they're going to propose. I also think, you know, for us, we absolutely believe that it's important to be good neighbors so that we can continue to push our projects forward in the communities that we work in. So touching base with, you know, the elected official in your area to talk about your concerns, make your voice heard is a really good strategy as well. We definitely work closely with our council members and county supervisors and all of those to make sure that folks who are living in our properties feel heard, and that, you know, we maintain a safe housing.
Thank you so much, Regina. And then we have a recommendation here from Michael that Denise, you could also contact a legal services office in San Francisco. And he suggested Bay Area Legal Aid. So, okay. And then I do see here that, John, you put in
excuse me,
okay.
Jacqueline?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, this is Denise. The problem with all the elected officials is that you know, these contracts are not monitored. And the former director of the nonprofit housing, he became the director of the city department. He's the one that got paid almost $1 million in 3 years. And then, you know, he can reward his friends, his former colleagues in nonprofit housing with these jobs where they're making, you know, $200,000 and $300,000 a year with contracts with the city. So they're, you know, it's union busting because city jobs are well paid. And then the workers for the nonprofit do not make a living wage. And then the property management, I mean, it's criminal behavior. And they don't seem to be, they do monitor the building. The building is beautiful. It's affordable. But I mean, they threatened to change my locks the day after I paid the rent and seize my property. And they've been in my U.S. mailbox. They've committed extortion. I mean, we're talking criminal behavior here. And then the support service was afraid to help me. She said she doesn't want to lose her job because I'm persona non grata. And I mean, I'm going to need witness protection because I will fight them. But it's public money. And, you know, millions of dollars of public money is going into private pockets. And where's the incentive to solve homelessness? Because calling yourself a poverty fighter is quite lucrative. And they get away with criminal behavior. And it's, but I have tried the local remedies. So that's why I thought maybe there's something through the low income tax credit because they're federal civil rights violations.
So, I mean, it's hard to go through the tax credit program because it's regulated by the IRS. So unless they're violating the requirement to rent to rent restricted populations or rent at certain levels, it's hard because of how the IRS regulates to go through that. that program.
What about these federal civil rights violations? I mean, people who commit routinely federal civil rights violation are not going to be given these competitive tax credit benefits in the future, right?
And that's why the state allocating committee would have to know that they're violating certain rights to know not to allocate to them in the future. But I'm not sure how that monitoring works at the state level because it is such a large program. It's hard to say, you know, how to get through that sort of bureaucracy.
Right. That's what I'm working on. I've kept incredible records. I used to work for the Bar Association. I'm a writer. But I mean, my blood pressure, you know, I'm on, you know, I was ready for, you know, I had high enough numbers for organ failure. I'm on prescription. I mean, it's really, really, really put me in jeopardy. But, you know, I'm fighting them, but it's total David and Goliath. They own San Francisco. They own the people that monitor them. Adult Protective Service, that person used to work for them in 4 locations. I mean, they're very, very powerful. So, but anyway, I'm very encouraged by what's happening with social housing and alternatives to, you know, this being co-opted by for private profit and nonprofits. Thank you.
Nice. Yeah, thank you. So we're a few minutes from the end, and I just want to go ahead and put in the chat a few ways to stay in touch with the groups from today. So that's our emails and websites. And then I did see one last question, which maybe we can try to tackle, and then we can close it for tonight, which is, do you think that LIHTC should be reformed or replaced entirely by another system? And how can we leverage on the federal level?
I can go first. So the whole point of providing tax credits to corporations that need them is to place the responsibility for monitoring, determining, owning, you know, affordable housing with these private entities. So it's hard to reform that, right? The base of it is, at the end of the day, the decision is with an investor whether or not they want to invest in one development over another. And over time, the industry becomes very structured, more narrow, right? You have sweet spots about what ideal project is. And yeah, we push that industry. We push what tax credits can do. We stretch it, but it can't do it all. I think that's why we're here today, is to talk about the need for, you know, housing to be built and that's affordable for people to be built through all different kinds of methods. And so with that, I'll turn it to someone else who can talk more about those alternative methods in their opinion.
Yeah, I would just say that a couple of things. First of all, I think we're really fortunate to have folks like Regina who, frankly, have bent over backwards to make lemonade out of lemons in those situations. I mean, I want to recognize the people that work incredibly hard within the what we all recognize as limitations, what we have available to us through this largely market-driven model. And I think what we're talking about here is an alternative to that model. I think what we're talking about here are the potentials to see housing again as a public good and a right, and not as something that's subject to one's ability to play in the casino and win one. Because that's essentially what you're doing at this point if you're playing in that market. So I think that's kind of one of the big sort of like bottom lines of the conversation, is that this provides a different kind of approach that I think opens up new kinds of opportunities and possibilities. But that's not to overshadow, I think, the work of people who are again, doing everything they can within that framework.
All right. And I think
Hi,
go ahead, Ken.
Can I just inject a thought or comment? I think with the new work paradigm post-COVID of part work at home, part work in the office, there should be less pressure on having to live in or near metropolitan areas. So why is it not possible to promote development in more outlying areas where the cost of land is lower in order to build affordable housing? And a corollary to that would be build high-rise housing or apartments, which will cost a lot less than low-rise. On the same piece of land, you can double the density of the units that are being built on a given piece of land. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for exploring and imagining alternatives here in San Jose. I think that a lot of us come here because we know that we need to look at something different, or we heard social housing and we're like, what is that? And so I really do hope that this was a useful evening for you, and that you learned something new, and then you connected with someone. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank you.